9 of 17. That is how many war crimes charges a British military court found proven against Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in December 1949. 32 years later, a retired Bundeswehr lieutenant colonel sits down at a desk in West Germany with a stack of his dead father's unpublished papers and starts deciding what the public gets to read. His name is Rüdiger von Manstein. By the time he is finished, one of the most senior officers convicted by the Allies after the Second World War will read, in print, less like a criminal and more like a soldier who is simply doing his job. This is Nick's World War II archive. If you want the stories the big war channels won't touch, subscribe. There is a lot more in the file room. Erich von Manstein has 2 sons. The elder, Gero, is an infantry lieutenant following his father into the army the way officers' sons usually do. He dies near Lake Ilmen in Russia in October 1942, 19 years old, killed in a war his own father is busy winning battles for. The younger son, Rüdiger, is born in 1929. He is 13 when his brother dies and 16 when the war ends. Too young to fight at all. He spends the war years a schoolboy in a country at war, watching his father's name rise through the newspapers. Sevastopol, the Crimea, the long fighting retreats across the Eastern Front, while men only a few years older than himself freeze to death by the tens of thousands. Sevastopol falls to Manstein's 11th Army in July of 1942, after an 8-month siege that cost both sides tens of thousands of men, and it is the victory that turns his name into a household one back in Germany. He goes on to command an entire army group on the Eastern Front, one of Hitler's most trusted operational minds, right up until the 2 men clash over strategy in the spring of 1944, and Manstein is relieved of command. He spends the last year of the war without a field command at all, and when the war ends, he is captured by the British, not the Soviets, a detail that matters enormously for what happens to him next. A man in Soviet custody in 1945 does not get a defense barrister, a sympathetic press, or a former prime minister writing letters on his behalf. Erich von Manstein does. By 1945, the father is a prisoner of the British. By 1949, he is a defendant. The trial runs in Hamburg from August to December of that year. A British military tribunal working through 17 separate charges. The core of the case is the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war and the killing of civilians in territory his armies controlled on the Eastern Front. Deportations, executions, reprisal actions carried out under commands that passed through his headquarters. The court acquits Manstein on 8 of the 17 counts, including everything tied directly to the extermination of the Jews. It convicts him on 9. The sentence is 18 years. Watch how fast that number moves. 18 years becomes 12 within months, cut down on review in February of 1950. Then pressure starts arriving from directions no ordinary convicted war criminal ever gets. Winston Churchill speaks publicly on Manstein's behalf. So does Konrad Adenauer, soon to be the Chancellor of a country that does not yet officially have an army of its own. So does a British military historian named B.H. Liddell Hart, who has struck up a direct correspondence with the imprisoned Field Marshal and will later help broker the English translation of his memoir. Manstein's own defense barrister keeps the legal pressure running in parallel. On the 7th of May, 1953, a little more than 4 years into an 18-year sentence, Erich von Manstein walks out of prison. Officially, the reason is health, a recurring worsening problem with his eyes. Liddell Hart's involvement is not a small footnote. He is one of the most influential military theorists writing in English at the time, and he does not simply sign a petition. He corresponds with Manstein directly through the prison years, treats him less like a convicted war criminal and more like a colleague whose reputation deserves rescuing, and stays close enough to the project that when Manstein's own wartime memoir is finally translated into English in 1958. 5 years after his release, Liddell Hart is credited with helping shepherd it into print. A war crimes conviction, in other words, does not end this man's ability to publish his version of events to an English-speaking readership. It barely slows it down. He goes home to a family missing one son and still raising the other. Rüdiger was 16 when the war ended and is 24 the year his father comes home. Within a few years, he does something almost nobody outside Germany stops to find strange. He puts on a military uniform himself. Not the old one, the new one. Rüdiger von Manstein joins the Bundeswehr, the army of a West Germany that did not exist when his father was still fighting the Red Army. West Germany does not want a new army at all at first. The phrase people use in the early 1950s is "ohne mich," without me, a country that just buried millions of its own men in a war it started, telling its politicians it wants no part of a second one. Konrad Adenauer pushes rearmament through anyway, over that public reluctance, as the price the Western Allies demand for full membership in NATO. And once the decision is made, there is a harder, more practical problem sitting underneath the political fight. Where do you find officers to run an army when your last generation of officers just lost the largest war in human history, and half of them are sitting in Allied prisons or dead? By 1959, 12,360 of the Bundeswehr's 14,900 professional officers carry Wehrmacht service records on their files. That is 83 men out of every 100. Rewind further to 1956, barely a year after the army's founding, and 31 of its 38 generals are former Wehrmacht officers too. West Germany did not build a new officer corps from scratch. It rehired the old one, almost man for man, and put it back to work under a different flag. One name sits above all the others on that list: Adolf Heusinger, sworn in as one of the Bundeswehr's very first lieutenant generals in the autumn of 1955. 2 years later, he holds 4 stars and becomes the Bundeswehr's first inspector general, its senior uniformed officer, the man every other general in the new army answers to. During the war, Heusinger runs Army General Staff operations, planning starting in October of 1940. One of the small circle of men deciding where German divisions move on the Eastern Front. It is a desk job with a body count attached, declassified American intelligence files, released decades later under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, describe him initialing 2 of the war's most notorious directives: the Commissar Order, which stripped legal protection from captured Soviet political officers, and the Commando Order, which did the same to captured Allied commandos. Because he cooperates after the war, the files note, no further action is taken against him. He is not tried at Nuremberg. He is promoted. Think about what that job actually looked like from the inside. Heusinger is not commanding troops in the field. He is at a desk in the Army High Command, moving divisions on a map, and the map he is moving them across is the same territory where the Commissar Order and the Commando Order are being carried out by the units he is directing. Paper does not pull a trigger, but a paper is what tells the man holding the rifle that the person in front of him has no legal protection left. That is the distance and the closeness built into a staff officer's war. Moscow does not forget what those orders meant on the ground. In December of 1961, right as Heusinger leaves the Bundeswehr to chair NATO's military committee in Washington, the Soviet Union publicly demands his extradition, accusing him of responsibility for the systematic killing of civilians in Belarus during anti-partisan operations under his authority. The West does not hand him over. He finishes his NATO posting untouched and retires with his reputation on this side of the Iron Curtain, essentially intact. So a convicted field marshal's son puts on a Bundeswehr uniform, and standing above him in that same new army is a general the Soviet Union once tried for war crimes of his own. Nobody in West Germany treats either fact as disqualifying. That is the institution Rüdiger von Manstein spends his career inside, rising eventually to Lieutenant Colonel of the Reserve. One uniform among tens of thousands built out of the wreckage of the last one. But wearing that uniform quietly is not where this story ends. Erich von Manstein dies in 1973, 70 years old, in Bavaria. 20 years removed from the prison cell he walked out of in 1953. He leaves behind more than a grave. He leaves behind boxes of writing, post-war reflections on strategy and politics that he never finished shaping into a finished book while he was alive. 8 years after his father's death, in 1981, Rüdiger von Manstein sits down with a military historian named Theodor Fuchs to finish the job his father started and never completed. Somewhere in a family house are the boxes themselves, draft chapters, loose reflections on strategy and post-war politics, the kind of writing a man produces when he has 2 decades of free time and a reputation he is still trying to shape after the fact. Fuchs brings the historian's craft. Rüdiger brings the one thing no outside editor has: the right, as the surviving family, to decide what gets included and what stays in a drawer. Together they edit and publish Soldier in the 20th Century, a collection of his father's previously unpublished post-war writings. The cover credits all 3 names: father, historian, son. No historian has ever put a firm name on what Rüdiger was doing when he agreed to that credit line. Nobody has produced a letter, a diary entry, an interview where he says, in so many words, "I am doing this to protect my father's name." So take what follows for exactly what it is. Not a documented confession, just a pattern laid end to end for you to weigh yourself. A war crimes convict, acquitted of the worst charges, quietly supported into early release by Churchill and a sympathetic British historian. That same Field Marshal's own wartime memoir, carried into English years before his death, with that historian's direct help. And then, after the man himself is gone, his surviving son sitting down to finish curating how his writing gets remembered, favorably framed, in his own father's voice. 3 decades after a British court had already put a number on what that voice had once ordered done on the Eastern Front. Read into that whatever you find there. Nobody who was actually in the room to explain why has left an answer behind. What is documented, and what nobody else telling this story online has bothered to trace, is what happens next. Inside the same institution, both father and son wore the uniform of. For decades, the Bundeswehr's relationship with its Wehrmacht inheritance sits mostly unexamined. Barracks across West Germany carry the names of Second World War commanders. Young officers who will one day serve under NATO train in buildings named for men who once served under Hitler, and almost nobody in uniform is asked to explain the difference out loud. The founding generation, Rüdiger von Manstein's generation, simply does not have this argument. The men who trained them were the same men who led them a decade earlier, and questioning a barracks name would have meant questioning half the chain of command standing in the room. Then, in 2017, that silence breaks all at once. A Bundeswehr lieutenant using the alias Franco A is arrested, caught posing as a Syrian refugee while allegedly planning a far-right terror attack under that false identity. The search of his old barracks turns up Wehrmacht memorabilia sitting openly on display, decades after anyone in command should have needed to ask whether that belonged there. In March of 2018, then Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen signs a new Traditionserlass, fresh guidelines spelling out which parts of German military history the Bundeswehr is actually permitted to honor and which it is not. It forces a barracks-by-barracks reckoning that Rüdiger von Manstein's own generation never had to sit through. Hanover's Emich-Cambrai Kaserne is renamed for a non-commissioned officer instead of a general. Munster's Schulz-Lutz-Kaserne becomes the Uerzetal Kaserne in 2019. Rothenburg's Lendkaserne named for a Luftwaffe night fighter ace, becomes the Von Düring Kaserne in 2020. Now look at what the same review board leaves standing. 2 barracks named for Erwin Rommel, one in Augustdorf and one in Dornstadt, survived that review untouched. Rommel's forced suicide in 1944, punishment for his ties to the plot against Hitler, is judged worth honoring in a way a purely wartime combat record on its own is not. No barracks anywhere in the Bundeswehr carries the name Manstein. None carries the name Heusinger either. There was never one to rename. Erwin Rommel's own son, Manfred, never wears a Bundeswehr uniform at all. As a teenager, he tries to volunteer for the Waffen-SS during the war itself. His father talks him out of it. No record survives of him ever putting on the post-war army's uniform either, unlike Guderian's son, unlike Model's son, unlike Rüdiger von Manstein. Manfred Rommel becomes a lawyer instead, then a career civil servant, then, for 22 years, the mayor of Stuttgart. One general's son spends decades helping carry his father's writing into print. Another general's son walks away from the whole institution and spends his career answering to voters at the ballot box instead. By the time the 2018 reckoning finally arrives, it never touches Manstein or Heusinger directly. There is no barracks bearing either name for a review board to argue over in the first place. Nobody ever has to take Erich von Manstein's name off a gate, because nobody ever put it there. A court in Hamburg once needed 9 separate counts to describe what Erich von Manstein had done. His son needed 1 afternoon at a desk, 3 names on a cover, and a book that is still in print today. Nobody ever had to take his father's name off a gate. His son found a better way to defend it.